5. The Streets of Exile.
Ash-gray mornings.
Night broke without dawn. It was an abrupt transition from the blackness of the vigil to a gray, suffocating world of smoke and cold. The fire, the final embers of the cedar beams from 647, had gone out sometime before the first prayer call, and the air over KAZANCHIS was now sharp enough to sting the lungs and crystallize the breath. Nahom woke with his cheek pressed into the dirt, not just any dirt, but the specific, sacred silt where his grandmother Wilsini's roses had once thrived. For a long, disorienting minute, he did not know whether he was a living man or a dream residing inside the dust. He lay still, listening for the sound of the jabina bubbling or the colonel's morning radio, but there was only the hollow whistle of the wind through exposed rebar. He pushed himself up slowly, his joints creaking like the old houses had. Around him lay nothing but a lunar landscape of rubble and silence. The city that had once throbbed with the Mamila laughter, the jazz and blues of the old legendary bars, and the rhythmic chanting of her children, was now flat, empty, and blind. The landmarks were gone, but the map remained etched into his marrow.
Ghost cartography.
Even amidst the ruins, his mind projected the old world onto the gray void. There, he pointed a trembling finger, was the bakery, where the scent of bread rose each dawn like a prayer. A little further up stood Kifre Nahom, the tavern where his father, AYNE'ALEM, had once drunk and argued with strangers who became brothers. There, where the concrete now gaped like an open wound, had been the narrow alley Chambi built, Kechinawa Minged, the thin, master-crafted way that had carried so many weary feet home. And there, buried under the weight of the new road's shadow, were the foundations of 647, the pulse of the entire world. There, where now police gather under the streetlight, fearing the darkness of the deserted nights, lived Addis Dena Deru, the multi-talented artist who passed so young. Next door was the Container Bar. Behind it, the first professional gym of Addis Ababa, owned by another Addis who represented Ethiopia for the first time in an international bodybuilding tournament. He gathered what the machines had missed: old pots, jabinas, cefides, mesabs, icons, books, a piece of corrugated tin, a splinter of wood, and a single brick with N.A. pressed into its center. The words etched not even having begun to fade, for the city was sentenced to die while still so young, and most of her homes, even those deemed old, had barely aged. He arranged them like relics on an altar. They were his crown jewels. He sat before them in a state of holy defiance, a king of the debris.
The officer and the heir.
By the time the sun rose, a pale, indifferent disk, the police had returned. They moved through the ruins like scavengers of the spirit. They didn't look Nahom in the eye. They looked at his rags and his dirt. "You can't stay here," one said, his hand resting on his belt. Nahom smiled, a smile colder than the morning air.
"Where else can I go?"
"Go where your kind belongs," the officer muttered, kicking a cloud of dust over the arranged relics.
"My kind,"
whispered Nahom.
"You mean the people who built this city? The ones who kept her heart beating while you were still learning to spell her name? You mean the nobles and the builders?"
He laughed, but the sound didn't rise. It came out like a sob, heavy with the weight of the sacking.
"Scavenger."
Days blurred into nights, nights folded into each other like the pleats of a priest's robe. Nahum began to lose count of the calendar. The only clock that mattered was the rhythmic demand of his body, the gnawing of hunger, the parched salt of thirst, the leaden pull of fatigue. He scavenged from the piles of debris, not for food, but for memory. He found a half-burnt cushion that still smelled of his aunt's perfume, a bent spoon that had served 1,000 meals, a notebook with singed edges containing the exact lines of many drawings. He lit fires using the wood of his own life and spoke to the shadows in the lonely evenings.
"KAZANCHIS, do you hear me? I am still here, and I will never leave you."
When the rain came, it was a baptism. The drops hissed against the hot ashes, cooling the anger of the earth. Nahum turned his face upward and let the water wash away the soot of the demolition. He remembered Wasin's voice, a steady anchor in the storm.
"Stand strong, son. Stand tall. Know even when floods flood, no river can drown a mountain's air."
The departed.
He believed her, but the reality of the streets was a cruel teacher. Engishu was drowned, only reaching 40, a man whose laughter had been the punctuation of the neighborhood, gone in a heartbeat because the cold had reached his soul. And Abu Li'i, the sentinel of the ruins, had vanished. Some said the night had swallowed him, others whispered that the prosperity vans had taken him to a place with no names. Nahum felt the city was a Saturnian beast, devouring its own children. Every face he knew was disappearing, one to hunger, another to despair, another to the silence of the corridor plan. Addis, the mother of light, had become a graveyard of erased identities.
Vanishing.
One night, he saw a shadow moving between the ruins.
"Abuli!"
he called out. There was no answer. Abuli had been given a studio in the distant concrete desert of Yeka Abado, but he had refused to leave. He had said there was no life beyond the pulse of KAZANCHIS. He had stayed, like Nahum, a sentinel of the debris. But that night, the shadow merged with the fog. The next morning, the news moved through the ruins like a cold draft. Engishu was gone. A stroke, they said, brought on by the cold and the sheer heartbreak of seeing the schools and health centers, the bakeries and the bars, the homes and the shops he knew all his life dismantled. And Abuli? Abuli had vanished. The city swallowed them both without a trace, erasing the witnesses as efficiently as it had erased the walls.
The two rivers of blood.
He walked at night past the gleaming towers of the hotels, cold, glass monoliths standing where homes once breathed. From their high windows, foreign guests sipped imported wine, looking down but never seeing the bones of the patriots beneath the pavements. At the gates of the Hilton, he paused. He remembered coming here as a child with his father, AYNE'ALEM, the legend from the Kele, the proud descendant of Aksumite royalty who had fled the wars of the north to find freedom in the heart of hearts during the Derg.
"See, my son,"
had said Ainu, gesturing to the fountains.
"This is Ethiopia too. Beauty that needs no permission."
Now Nahum stood at the same gate, ragged and barefoot, a ghost in his own kingdom.
"You were right, Ainiti," he whispered. "But they forgot that beauty requires a soul."
The cold gnawed at his bones, but a fiercer heat was rising from his gut. Each humiliation by the task force, each mocking laugh from the developers became fuel. He felt the two rivers of his blood, the colonel's discipline and AYNE'ALEM's defiance, merge into a single, unstoppable current. The ancestors were no longer memories, they were architects of his will. "Rise," they whispered.
Rise, Ras.
Zeminait. Zeminait is the woman who counts the missing at the gate. She is not a map of borders, but a map of scars. We are coming home, not to a myth, but to the wood and the clay. We come to wash the soot from her face and rebuild her house, room by room.
He began to write. He used scraps of cardboard, the back of demolition notices, and the very walls that had been marked for destruction. He wrote in the charcoal of his home.
"You think you've buried us,"
he wrote in jagged, bold letters.
"But seeds are always buried before they bloom. You took our homes, but you cannot take our horizon. We are the rightful heirs of this soil. We are the voice of Zeminait Ethiopia."
The displaced began to gather. They came from Fitbur, from Eret Kilo, from Piasa, from Abuari. They were the unseen who lived in the cracks of the new towers. They came because someone was finally speaking the language of the heart, the language that said Addis Ababa belongs to her children, not her conquerors.
End exile.
One night, Nahom climbed the mound of rubble that had once been the veranda of 647. He looked east, toward the rising sun. The first light touched the spires of St. Uriel, gilding the dust-filled air until it looked like the golden interior of an Ethiopian crown. He raised his hand, the hand of a laborer, a mourner, and a king. "No more sorrow," he said, his voice carrying over the flattened plains of sweet old KAZANCHIS. "From here on, sovereignty." The sun rose, and for a moment the shadows of the skyscrapers seemed to shrink. That was how exile ended. It was not a journey across a border or a flight to a foreign land. Exile ended when the king stopped mourning the ruins and began to command the future. He had reclaimed his country from within the dirt.
I am Nahom. The story has just begun. Zeminait Ethiopia, we are your children, and we are coming home. She's not myth, not map. She's mother.